The house felt different the moment he walked through the door. It wasn't something I could pinpoint exactly, but there was a shift in the air, a weight settling in my chest, a quiet disturbance in a life that had become too predictable. My husband had told me his younger brother was coming to stay for a while, but he said it in passing, like it was just another errand to check off a list. I had nodded, barely reacting, my mind preoccupied with a grocery list or some mundane task that kept me moving through the endless repetition of my days. But now, standing in the dimly lit entryway, I realized I had underestimated just how much his presence would change things. I hadn't seen him in years. The last time he was here, he was just a boy in my eyes. Reckless, impulsive, always chasing something he couldn't quite catch. But the man standing before me now was nothing like the boy I remembered. He was taller, broader, the sharp edges of youth smoothed into something more controlled, more deliberate. His presence filled the space in a way that made me acutely aware of myself, my posture, the way my fingers instinctively brushed my hair back as if to compose myself. His eyes met mine, and for a brief second I saw something flicker there, something unreadable, something that made my stomach tighten before I quickly looked away. My husband clapped him on the back, laughing in that effortless way he always did, pulling him into a quick hug before leading him inside. "Feels like forever," my husband said, his voice filled with genuine warmth. "You look good." His brother smiled, a lopsided grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, well, time does that." His voice was deeper, rougher than I remembered, like someone who had seen things, lived through things. I stayed quiet, standing slightly behind my husband, observing more than participating. He glanced at me again, just a flicker, a half-second too long, and then he was moving, dropping his bag near the couch, stretching as if he belonged here. Dinner was quiet at first. My husband did most of the talking, catching up on family news, work, the usual small talk that filled the silences of a life spent together. I nodded at the right moments, added a word or two, but my focus kept drifting. He had a way of sitting back, arms resting loosely on the table, eyes scanning the room like he was taking it all in, like he was remembering something. And then, in the middle of my husband's story about work, he spoke, his voice cutting through the rhythm of the conversation. "You haven't changed much," he said, looking at me, his expression unreadable. My hand tightened around my fork. It wasn't a compliment, wasn't a statement about my appearance. It was something else entirely, something laced with memory, something that pulled at the edges of the past. My husband chuckled, oblivious. "She keeps everything in order around here." His brother didn't smile. He just nodded, still watching me. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look away, forcing myself to focus on the clatter of silverware, the low hum of the television playing in the background, anything but the way his gaze lingered a moment too long. After dinner, my husband went to his office, leaving us alone in the living room. The silence stretched between us, heavy and unspoken. I busied myself with meaningless tasks, adjusting the pillows on the couch, stacking a few books, pretending not to notice the way he was watching me. He leaned back, stretching out his legs, his voice casual but pointed. "It's been a long time." I nodded, keeping my movements measured, controlled. "Yeah, it has." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly, a small, almost imperceptible smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "You really haven't changed." Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. I forced myself to meet his gaze, steadying my voice. "And you have." He tilted his head slightly as if considering the question. "I think we both know the answer to that." The room felt too warm, the space between us too small, and for the first time in years I felt something stir in me. Something I shouldn't have felt, something I thought I had buried a long time ago. The house had settled into a quiet rhythm, but I could feel the shift. It was subtle, an undercurrent just beneath the surface, something I couldn't quite name but felt in every glance, every unspoken word, every moment that stretched just a second too long. My husband's younger brother had been here for only a few days, yet his presence had already begun to disrupt the stillness I had grown accustomed to. I had lived in predictable patterns for years. Morning routines, evening silences, a marriage that was steady but devoid of the kind of tension that made a person feel truly alive. Now there was something different, something humming beneath my skin that made me hyper-aware of every movement, every interaction, every brush of proximity. He wasn't doing anything overtly inappropriate, nothing I could call him out on, but there was a weight to the way he looked at me, a patience in his presence, like he was waiting for something. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into things, that I was projecting emotions I had no business feeling, but the air between us was thick with something unsaid, something neither of us had acknowledged but both of us had begun to respond to. My husband had been working late every night, coming home exhausted, barely noticing anything outside of his usual routine. That left the two of us alone more often than I was comfortable with, but I never said anything, never made an excuse to leave the room when he was there, never distanced myself the way I probably should have. It started small, almost insignificant, casual conversations, harmless exchanges, moments that felt ordinary until they didn't. One evening he offered to help around the house, fixing a cabinet door that had been loose for months. I hesitated, knowing it was unnecessary, knowing I could wait for my husband to do it, but I agreed, telling myself it was just practical, just convenience. As he worked, I stayed close, watching, making small talk, pretending this was normal, pretending the way he moved, the easy confidence, the strength in his arms, the way he seemed completely in control, didn't affect me in ways I didn't want to admit. I reached for something on the counter, shifting past him, and felt his gaze on me, lingering, heavy, unflinching. I didn't turn, didn't meet his eyes, didn't acknowledge what was happening, but my pulse quickened, my breath caught, my body betrayed me in ways I couldn't ignore. It was nothing, I told myself. Look. A moment. Meaningless. But the way my skin burned under his attention told me otherwise. Later we found ourselves sitting at the kitchen table, the house quiet except for the ticking of the clock, the occasional distant sound of a car passing by. Our conversation drifted, slipping into something more personal, something that felt almost dangerous. He talked about the past, about when he was younger, about how he used to see me, how he used to think I was perfect, untouchable, someone he could never get close to. He said it with a half-smile, a casual tone, but the words settled between us like a secret, like something he had never admitted before. I laughed it off, shaking my head, pretending it was nothing, but my chest felt tight, my hands unsteady against the surface of the table. He didn't push, didn't elaborate, but his eyes held something deeper, something more serious, something that made it impossible to pretend I didn't understand. I tried to change the subject, tried to steer the conversation back to something safe, but every word felt thin, every attempt at distance felt like an excuse neither of us believed. He leaned back in his chair, watching me, his gaze steady, measuring. "You're different than I remember," he said, voice low, thoughtful. I forced a small smile, swallowing the knot in my throat. "People change." He tilted his head slightly, considering that. "Maybe. But some things don't." I should have walked away then, should have ended the conversation, should have put space between us before it was too late. But I stayed because part of me didn't want to stop this, didn't want to erase whatever this was before I even knew what it could become. It was dangerous. It was wrong. But it was also intoxicating. I could feel it slipping away from me, control dissolving like smoke, and for the first time in years I didn't want to hold on. The house was silent, the kind of deep, late-night quiet that made every small sound feel amplified, every footstep on the wooden floor like a secret exposed. I hadn't planned on running into him, hadn't expected anyone to be awake at this hour, but as I reached the kitchen, the dim glow of the refrigerator light illuminated more than just the half-empty shelves. It revealed him, leaning against the counter, one hand wrapped around a glass of water, the other resting casually at his side. For a second I thought about turning around, pretending I hadn't seen him, retreating before I could make another mistake, but his eyes met mine and it was too late. There was something about the way he looked at me in that moment, something unspoken, something that made my breath catch in my throat before I forced myself to keep walking. The kitchen, usually a space of routine and familiarity, now felt different. Smaller, warmer, filled with something I didn't want to name. The air between us was thick with the weight of the past few days, with the tension we both had been pretending wasn't there, but now, in the stillness of the night, there was no one left to perform for, no distractions to keep us on the right side of the line we were dangerously close to crossing. I opened the cabinet, reached for a glass, felt his presence behind me, too close, too aware. I took a slow breath, steadying myself, and turned. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He shook his head, studying me, his expression unreadable. "You." I hesitated, then shrugged. "Just thirsty." He didn't move, didn't break eye contact, and for a moment we just stood there, the quiet between us louder than any words we could have spoken. Then, without warning, the conversation shifted, slipping into something deeper, something more dangerous. He asked me if I was happy. The question caught me off guard, sent a sharp pulse of something painful through me because it was so direct, so unexpected, so brutally honest in a way I wasn't ready for. I wanted to lie, wanted to give the easy answer, the one I had given 100 times before, but the look in his eyes made it impossible. Instead, I gave him the truth, or at least a version of it. "I don't know," I admitted, my fingers tightening around the glass, my throat suddenly dry for reasons that had nothing to do with thirst. He nodded slowly, as if he understood, as if he had known the answer before he even asked the question. He took a step closer, the movement deliberate, testing the space between us, seeing if I would pull away. I should have walked out, ended this before it could begin, but I didn't move, didn't stop him, didn't breathe as he reached up, brushed a stray strand of hair from my face, his fingers barely grazing my skin but igniting something in me that I couldn't control. The air between us crackled with something undeniable, something reckless and irreversible, something that had been building for days, maybe longer, maybe since the moment he walked through the door. His eyes searched mine, waiting, giving me a chance to step back, to say no, to stop this before it went any further. But I didn't move. And then, before I could think, before I could rationalize, before I could stop what was already happening, he leaned in and his lips met mine. It was quick, a moment suspended in time, a fleeting mistake that changed everything. His mouth was warm, the kiss both hesitant and certain, a collision of restraint and inevitability, and for a second, just one, I let myself fall into it. But then reality slammed back into me and I pulled away, my pulse hammering, my breath unsteady, my entire body suddenly cold with the weight of what I had just done. I saw the flicker of something in his expression, regret? Satisfaction. But I didn't stay long enough to find out. Without a word, without looking back, I turned and walked away, my hands trembling, my mind racing, my heart pounding with the terrifying realization that there was no undoing what had just happened. I spent the next day pretending it never happened, convincing myself that if I ignored it, if I pushed it far enough to the back of my mind, it would fade into nothing, become just another fleeting mistake, something insignificant, something I could bury beneath the weight of routine. I moved through the house with purpose, keeping myself busy, avoiding him without making it obvious, making sure there was always space between us, always something in the way. A door, a table, my own carefully placed distance. But he didn't make it easy. He acted as if nothing had changed, as if that kiss in the kitchen, that moment that had shattered every rule I had built around myself, was something I had imagined. He was relaxed, effortless, moving through the house with an ease that made me resent him, made me wonder if it had meant nothing to him at all. And yet, there was something in his eyes when he looked at me, something calculated, something patient, like he was waiting to see what I would do. I told myself I was in control. I told myself it wasn't going to happen again. But then my husband left for work and suddenly the house felt smaller, the walls too close, the air too thick, and before I could stop it, there he was, standing in the doorway watching me. I froze, my pulse kicking up, every muscle in my body tensing, waiting. He didn't move, didn't push, just stood there, unreadable, until finally he spoke. "I'm sorry." The words were quiet, even, but there was something else beneath them, something that made my stomach tighten. It shouldn't have happened. I swallowed hard, nodding, wanting to believe it, needing to believe it. No. It shouldn't have. But he didn't leave. He stayed there, watching me, studying me, and then he tilted his head slightly, that almost smile playing at the corner of his mouth. That look that had always made me feel like I was being tested, like he was seeing how far he could push before I would break. "You don't believe that," he said simply. My breath caught, my skin heating, a sharp pulse of frustration mixing with something far more dangerous. "You don't know what I believe." He exhaled, a soft, amused sound, stepping further into the room, closing the space between us in a way that felt deliberate, careful. "I know you're avoiding me," he said, voice low, almost teasing. "And I know why." I turned away, grabbing the nearest thing I could find. Some papers, a dish, anything to keep my hands busy, anything to ground myself in something that wasn't him. "You're imagining things." "Am I?" He didn't sound convinced. I kept my back to him, focused on breathing, on keeping my voice steady, on pretending that his presence didn't unsettle me in ways I didn't want to name. "It was a mistake," I said, forcing the words out. "It won't happen again." Silence. A long drawn-out pause that stretched too thin, and then finally he spoke. "All right." I turned, surprised by how easily he agreed, but the way he looked at me told me everything I needed to know. He didn't believe me. He wasn't going to push, but he wasn't going to forget either. He was waiting, letting me be the one to break. And the worst part was I didn't trust myself not to. That night I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself I was in control. But then as I walked down the hall, as I passed him in the narrow space between rooms, he reached out. Just barely, just enough for his fingers to brush against my hand. It was the lightest touch, the smallest moment, but it sent a shock through me, a rush of something I had no name for, something that made my breath catch, something that made the world tilt beneath my feet. I pulled away, too fast, too obvious, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. Because if I had, I would have seen that he was smiling. I needed to clear my head, to pull myself back from the edge of something reckless, something I couldn't afford to let consume me. I told myself the answer was simple. Focus on my husband, rebuild the connection that had dulled over the years, remind myself of the life I had chosen, the life that was safe, steady, predictable. So when he suggested dinner, just the two of us, I agreed without hesitation, forcing enthusiasm into my voice, pretending this was exactly what I wanted, exactly what I needed to reset whatever had begun unraveling inside me. The restaurant was familiar, one we had been to countless times before, the kind of place where the waitstaff recognized us, where the lighting was dim enough to feel intimate but not so much that it hid the years of distance that had settled between us. My husband was in a good mood, smiling, relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in a while, and for a moment I let myself believe this could work, that I could redirect my thoughts, that I could bury the tension, the guilt, the sharp thrill of something I wasn't ready to name. He ordered my favorite wine without asking, a small gesture, but it made something inside me twist. Guilt, maybe, or nostalgia for a version of us that used to exist before everything had become so routine. He complimented me, told me I looked beautiful, and I smiled, grateful for the warmth in his voice, for the way he still saw me even when I felt invisible. I wanted to feel something real in that moment, wanted to believe that this was enough, that I could drown out the echoes of another voice, another touch, another presence that had begun haunting me in ways I couldn't control. I laughed at his jokes, reached for his hand across the table, tried to remind myself that this was where I belonged. The wine dulled the edges of my thoughts, softened the sharpness of my own betrayal, made it easier to lean into the moment, to let myself be present with the man who had always been good to me. When he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine, I didn't pull away. I kissed him back hard, with a desperation that surprised even me, as if I could pour everything into this moment, as if I could convince myself that nothing had changed. His hand settled on my waist, his touch familiar, safe, reassuring, but as the kiss deepened, as I let myself sink into it, a cold realization crept in. I wasn't thinking about him. My body responded, my breath hitched, but in my mind I was somewhere else, with someone else, caught in a different kind of tension, one that was dangerous, one that was alive, one that had nothing to do with the man in front of me. I tried to push the thought away, tried to focus on the warmth of my husband's hands, on the way he held me, like he still meant it, like he still believed in us, but the truth lodged itself deep inside me, refusing to be ignored. When the kiss broke, he looked at me with something unreadable, something almost hesitant, as if he sensed the shift, as if he could feel the way I was holding something back. He didn't say anything, didn't question it, but his eyes lingered on mine a second too long, searching, wondering, almost as if he knew that I was slipping away. I forced another smile, reached for my drink, pretended the moment hadn't happened, but deep down I knew something had cracked, something had shifted, something that could never be undone. The night was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to skin and made the air feel heavy, suffocating. I had stepped outside to clear my head, to get away from the weight pressing against my chest, to convince myself that the evening had been nothing more than another attempt at normalcy, another effort to hold on to a life that was slipping through my fingers. The dinner with my husband had been perfect on paper, exactly what I should have wanted, exactly what I needed to convince myself that everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. And I wasn't fine. I had kissed my husband with the intention of forgetting, of proving to myself that my feelings were under control. But the moment our lips had met, I had known the truth. My mind had already gone somewhere else. The guilt churned in my stomach, twisting into something dark, something I didn't want to name, but even worse than the guilt was the realization that a part of me didn't regret it. I leaned against the railing, inhaling deeply, trying to will away the thoughts circling my head. But then I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, like he had been waiting for me to be alone. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I already knew it was him. He came to stand beside me, close but not touching, silent for a moment, letting the tension settle between us before he finally spoke. Are we really going to pretend it didn't happen? His voice was low, steady, not accusing, just patient, just waiting. I clenched my jaw, gripping the railing tighter, keeping my gaze fixed on the dark outline of trees beyond the fence. It was a mistake, I said, forcing my voice to be even, forcing myself to sound like I believed it. He exhaled softly, not quite a laugh, but something close. You don't sound convinced. I turned then, finally meeting his gaze, trying to steady the storm inside me, trying to be stronger than whatever this was pulling me toward. It doesn't matter what I sound like, I said, the words sharper than I intended. It won't happen again. He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, his hands shoved into his pockets like he was giving me space, like he was holding back. You want to believe that, he said finally. But you don't. My stomach twisted, anger flaring beneath my skin. Not at him but at myself, at the way my resolve felt weaker every time he spoke, at the way his voice slid under my skin and made me feel exposed. You don't know what I believe. He tilted his head slightly, watching me like he was waiting for me to slip, waiting for the moment I would stop pretending. I know you're lying to yourself. His words hit harder than they should have, knocking the air from my lungs, making my fingers dig into the wood of the railing as I forced myself to hold my ground. But then he moved. Not much, just a step, just enough to close the space between us, just enough to make my breath hitch before I could stop it. His voice dropped lower, the heat of it brushing against my skin. Tell me to stop. My pulse pounded so loudly I thought he could hear it. My mouth parted, the words right there, but I didn't say them. I couldn't. He leaned in, too close, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath, close enough that if I moved even an inch our lips would touch. His hand barely grazed my arm. A touch so light it sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt my body betray me, leaning in when I should have pulled away. But then, at the last second, I snapped back to reality. I turned, stepping away so fast it felt like I had been burned, my breath unsteady, my entire body trembling with the force of what I almost let happen. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. Without another word, I walked back inside, slamming the door behind me, leaving him standing alone in the dark. But even as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, my body exhausted but my mind refusing to rest, I knew the truth. This wasn't over. And he knew it too. The air outside was thick, warm, carrying the scent of the night, a mix of cut grass and something distant, something that smelled like rain but never quite arrived. I needed a moment to breathe, to escape the weight pressing against my chest, to clear my head before it was too late. The dinner had been the same as every other, my husband talking, my hands moving on autopilot, my lips forming answers to questions I barely heard. I had smiled when I was supposed to, nodded at the right moments, played my role so perfectly it almost felt real. But the whole time I could feel it. His presence just beyond my vision, his silence heavy, his gaze a quiet force pressing against my skin, waiting, patient, knowing. I stepped onto the balcony, gripping the railing, inhaling deep, letting the coolness settle against my skin, willing the pounding in my chest to slow. But I wasn't alone. A door clicked softly behind me, the almost imperceptible sound of footsteps crossing the wooden floor, and then he was there, standing just close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He didn't speak. Neither did I. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been spoken in glances, in hesitation, in the moments we pretended not to notice. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was full, heavy, thick with something that had been building for too long, something neither of us could stop now. My hands tightened on the railing, my breath shallow, my body locked in place, waiting, knowing. The breeze lifted my hair and before I could react, his fingers brushed against my shoulder, tucking a loose strand behind my ear, the touch so light it could have been nothing, but it wasn't. His fingers lingered, the barest hesitation, his skin against mine for just a second too long, a moment that stretched, that burned, that made my throat tighten and my body betray me. I should have moved, should have stepped away, should have broken the moment before it could shatter me completely. But I didn't. I stood there, frozen, his touch searing into my skin, branding me with something I couldn't name, something I didn't want to name. I turned my head slightly, just enough to meet his gaze, and that was my mistake. His eyes were dark, unreadable, but there was something beneath the surface, something dangerous, something certain. It wasn't a question. It wasn't hesitation. It was inevitability. My breath caught, my pulse hammering, every muscle in my body tensed like a wire pulled too tight, about to snap. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything that would break the spell, that would push us back onto safer ground, but the words wouldn't come. Because the truth was, I didn't want to stop this. I never had. He took a step closer, barely closing the space between us, but it was enough. The world shrank to this moment, to the inches between us, to the heat radiating from his body, to the pull that had been there since the beginning, dragging us toward something that couldn't be undone. My fingers curled against the railing, my breath shallow, my mind screaming for control, but there was none left to hold on to. His gaze flickered to my lips, and I felt it then, the moment just before everything would change, the second before the fall. I turned before I could let myself break, before I could do something I wouldn't be able to take back, before I could let go completely. My footsteps were too quick, my body too tense, my hands trembling as I reached for the door, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. As I already knew. The night wasn't over. And neither were we. We had convinced ourselves that we were careful, that every moment of hesitation, every glance that lingered too long, every accidental touch that sent a shock through my veins was nothing more than a line we hadn't crossed, a temptation we hadn't given into. We had played the game well, staying just within the boundaries, balancing on the edge, telling ourselves that control was still ours to claim. But control was an illusion, and the moment it slipped, there was no getting it back. The night started like any other, ordinary in every way that mattered. My husband was supposed to be late, another long night at work, another evening where I could pretend everything was fine, where I could pretend my thoughts weren't tangled in something I should have never allowed to take root. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavier than usual, charged with something unspoken. I moved through the kitchen, aware of every movement, of the way my hands trembled slightly as I reached for a glass of water, of the way my breath caught the moment I felt him enter the room behind me. I didn't turn. I didn't have to. His presence was electric, humming through the air between us, filling the space with a tension that had long since become unbearable. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there, waiting, knowing. I closed my eyes for half a second, steadying myself, reminding myself that I still had a choice, that I could still step away before it was too late. But then I turned, and whatever control I had left shattered. His eyes met mine, dark, intense, no hesitation, no question. The space between us evaporated, and before I could think, before I could stop it, he was there, closer than he should have been, his hand brushing against my arm, his touch light but deliberate, testing, waiting for me to pull away. I didn't. My breath hitched, my body locked in place, every nerve in me screaming with the need to move, to react, to do something before this moment swallowed me whole. His fingers traced down my arms, slow, barely touching, but it sent a current through me so sharp I thought my knees would give out. He was too close now, his breath warm against my skin, his gaze locked onto mine, his hand rising to my jaw, tilting my face just slightly, just enough. And then he kissed me. It wasn't an accident, wasn't something that could be explained away as a lapse in judgment. It was deliberate, intentional, a decision made in the span of a heartbeat, one I couldn't take back. I should have pulled away, should have stopped it before it went any further, but the second his lips met mine, the world tilted and I was lost. The kiss was deep, urgent, filled with something that had been held back for too long, something that burned through my veins, unraveling every lie I had told myself. My hands found his shirt, gripping the fabric, pulling him closer instead of pushing him away, and in that moment I wasn't thinking, wasn't rational, wasn't anything but wanton heat and inevitability. And then the air shifted. A presence. A change. A sound that didn't belong. I felt it before I saw it, a weight pressing down on my chest. A chill racing up my spine. I turned too slowly, already knowing what I would find, already feeling the crash before it came. The door was open, and my husband was standing there. His face was unreadable, his eyes locked onto us, onto me, onto the truth that had unraveled right in front of him. His expression wasn't anger, wasn't immediate rage, it was worse. It was disbelief, shock, like the reality of what he was seeing hadn't fully registered. Like his brain was still trying to process something impossible. My breath caught, my pulse hammering, my body frozen, but inside, everything was collapsing. The moment stretched, silent, unbearable, a second that lasted an eternity, a second that changed everything. And then, without a word, without a single sound, he turned and walked away. He didn't yell. He didn't demand answers. He didn't rage or throw anything or spit accusations like I had imagined he would if this moment had ever come. He just stood there, watching, his expression unreadable, his body still, too still, as if his mind hadn't caught up to what his eyes were seeing. And that silence, God, that silence was worse than anything he could have said. I felt the weight of it pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe, making every second stretch unbearably long, making my pulse pound so loudly I thought it might deafen me. I opened my mouth, some desperate instinct to explain, to say something, anything, but nothing came out. There was no excuse, no justification, no way to make this anything other than what it was. I had betrayed him. And he knew it. He blinked slowly once as if coming out of a daze, and then without a word, without a single glance in his brother's direction, he turned and walked away. My body reacted before my brain did, my feet moving forward, my arm reaching out, my voice finally finding enough strength to whisper his name, but he didn't stop. The sound of the door closing behind him was deafening. I stood there, frozen, every part of me locked in place, my breath shallow, my hands trembling at my sides. I could still feel the ghost of the kiss lingering on my lips, the heat of it, the weight of what it had meant, but now it was tainted, stained by the moment that had followed. I had told myself so many lies, so many justifications, so many excuses for the pull I had refused to fight, but none of them mattered now. None of them had ever mattered. Because this wasn't just a mistake. It was destruction. I forced myself to turn, expecting, what? A smirk, a victorious glint in his eyes. Some sign that he had gotten what he wanted? But he wasn't smiling. He wasn't gloating. He looked shaken, unsettled, as if he too hadn't expected this to spiral the way it had, as if he had finally realized that there was no winning here, no outcome where either of us walked away unscathed. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply, his gaze darting away from mine like he couldn't stand to look at me. And somehow that was worse. Because for all the tension, for all the moments leading to this, it had always felt like he was the one in control, like he was pulling me toward something inevitable. But now he looked lost. Just like me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my mind racing, already unraveling at the edges. I stopped, not even sure what I was trying to say. I needed to fix this. I needed to undo it. There was no fixing this. There was no undoing it. I needed air. I needed space. I needed to be alone. Before he could say anything, before he could reach for me, before I could see the regret on his face, I turned and walked away, my heart slamming against my ribs, my stomach twisted into something cold and hollow. I called my husband once, twice, 5 times, but there was no answer. I sat on the edge of the bed that suddenly felt too big, staring at the phone in my hands, listening to the emptiness around me, feeling the weight of it settle deep into my bones. I had spent so long pretending not to feel trapped, pretending not to crave something more, pretending that what I had wasn't suffocating me. But now, for the first time in years, the house was empty. And I had never felt more alone. The house felt colder than it ever had before, emptier in a way that had nothing to do with space and everything to do with absence. I had spent the night staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound of a key turning in the lock, for footsteps in the hallway, for anything that meant I hadn't completely destroyed the life I had built. But the door never opened and the silence never broke. The weight of what I had done pressed into me, suffocating, inescapable, a slow unraveling of every choice I had made, every moment I had let slip through my fingers, every warning I had ignored. I had told myself that I was in control, that I could balance on the edge forever without falling. But I had fallen. And now there was nothing left to catch me. I couldn't sit still, couldn't stay trapped in this house that felt like a graveyard of my own making. I needed to see him, needed to look him in the eye and say something, anything that could make him understand. The drive was a blur, my hands gripping the wheel too tightly, my heart pounding harder with every mile, with every streetlight that passed, with every second that stretched too long. When I reached his office, I sat in the car for what felt like an eternity, staring at the entrance, at the glass doors that felt like a wall between us, at the life I had shattered and the man who was somewhere inside trying to erase me. When I finally stepped out, when I finally forced my feet forward, I already knew how this would end. He saw me the moment I entered, his posture going rigid, his jaw tightening, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. He didn't look away, but he didn't move toward me either. I swallowed, my throat dry, every word I had rehearsed dissolving the second I saw the way he looked at me, not with anger, not with hatred, but with something worse. Indifference. Please, I started, my voice barely more than a whisper, but he shook his head before I could say anything else. Don't. One word. Final. Absolute. A door slammed shut between us without ever being touched. I had expected anger, shouting, a release of the tension that had been suffocating us both since the moment he saw the truth. But this was worse. This was nothing. He turned away first, walking past me without another glance, leaving me standing there, hollow, abandoned, with the realization that I had already lost him. There was no fight to be had, no pieces to pick up, nothing left to salvage. I had destroyed everything, and now I had to live with what remained. I drove without direction, my hands gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping me upright, my thoughts spiraling, crashing, burning. When I reached the house, I knew who I was looking for before I even stepped inside. But the moment I saw him, I knew. He was leaving. His bag was packed, his jacket slung over his arm, his body tense in the way of someone bracing for impact. He didn't look surprised to see me. He had already made up his mind. "You're leaving," I said, the words falling flat between us, not a question, just a fact, just another inevitability I had failed to see coming. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly, rubbing a hand over his face like he was tired, like he had aged 10 years overnight. "This isn't what I wanted," he said, and for the first time I believed him. Because there was nothing left to want. Nothing left to fight for. Nothing left that hadn't already been broken. I wanted to ask him to stay, to tell him that we could figure it out, that we could fix the mess we had made. But the words wouldn't come because we both knew they would be a lie. He walked past me without looking back, without hesitation, without a trace of the fire that had once burned so hot between us. And then he was gone. And I was alone. The hours stretched, each one heavier than the last, each one pressing into me with the full weight of what I had done. The house that had once felt too small now felt cavernous, every room echoing with memories I could never relive, every shadow stretching too long. I sat at the table, staring at nothing, listening to the silence that had once been filled with laughter, with footsteps, with voices that were now only ghosts. I had thought I was chasing something real, something that would bring me back to life, something that would remind me what it felt like to burn. But all I had done was turn everything I touched into ash. And now there was no one left to save me from the fire.